The Church of St. Catherine's had been chosen not for spiritual significance, but for architectural adequacy. It possessed sufficient grandeur to satisfy social expectation while remaining close enough to the Merryweather estates to prevent unnecessary travel. The morning of the 23rd of April was precisely the kind of grey that England specialised in, not raining, not threatening rain, but holding the perpetual possibility of moisture, as though the sky itself was withholding judgment. Sophia Adelaide Merryweather stood before the mirror in her mother's chamber, or rather, what had been her mother's chamber, before the illness had taken her 3 years prior. The reflection that confronted her was a stranger wearing a wedding gown. The stranger was pale blonde, pale-skinned, pale in the way that suggested the painting itself had been executed in insufficient light. "You are extraordinarily beautiful," her father said, appearing in the doorway with the kind of blunt assessment that suggested he was evaluating livestock for market value rather than observing his daughter on her wedding day. "The Duke is fortunate." Sophia did not reply. She had learned over the course of her 22 years that responses to her father were rarely required. Opinions flowed from him with the kind of certainty that suggested he had never encountered a perspective that contradicted his own and found the very concept absurd. The Duke of Ravensmore was, by all available documentation, an extraordinarily advantageous match. He possessed extensive estates across 3 counties. His income exceeded £30,000 per annum. His title was ancient and respectable. Most significantly, he had been willing to accept a wife whose family's financial circumstances had become substantially more precarious than society believed. "The marriage settles the entailment question," her father continued, as though Sophia had asked for explanation of why she was being transferred from one household to another, with all the ceremony usually reserved for livestock auction. "Your brother will retain the estates. The family maintains social position. And you will become a duchess, which is considerably more than you deserve to become given your circumstances." Sophia understood, with the kind of clarity that came from 22 years of careful observation, that her circumstances, which included the permanent scarring of her forearms and the systematic destruction of her capacity to trust, were precisely what had made her a suitable candidate for marriage to a man like the Duke of Ravensmore. A man like him would not want genuine companionship. He would not seek emotional intimacy. He would require a wife who understood that marriage was obligation rather than opportunity, transaction rather than transformation. He would require a wife who knew how to remain invisible, even while occupying the most visible position a woman could achieve, which meant that Sophia was, paradoxically, exactly the right woman for the role. The ceremony itself was conducted with the kind of formality that transformed human connection into legal transaction. The vicar pronounced words about honor and duty. Society's representatives observed the proceedings with expressions that suggested they were evaluating the performance rather than witnessing something sacred. Sophia spoke her vows in a voice that did not waver. The Duke spoke his vows in a voice that suggested he was reading a legal contract rather than making promises to another human being. There was nothing in his tone to suggest pleasure, reluctance, or any emotional engagement whatsoever. When the vicar pronounced them married, the Duke took her hand with the kind of careful courtesy that one might extend to a stranger of whom one was vaguely suspicious. His hand was warm, and the grip was firm, but not comforting. She observed with the part of her mind that was perpetually analyzing physical details that his knuckles bore scars, the kind of scars that did not come from aristocratic pursuits. The reception was held at the Merryweather country estate, a house that had seen better decades and which communicated through its very architecture the family's gradual descent into financial precariousness. The guests circulated with the kind of purposeful networking that suggested they were assessing the accuracy of the marriage as advantageous for their own future strategic positioning. Sophia moved through the gathering with the kind of practiced invisibility that her mother had spent considerable effort developing in her. Smile, nod, accept compliments without believing them, maintain posture, wear the long sleeves despite the warmth of the room. Never allow anyone to observe the underlying reality of what existed beneath the pale fabric. "You are doing very well," David Ashford said, appearing at her side with drinks and the kind of solicitous courtesy that suggested he was attempting to communicate something beyond simple social nicety. He was the Duke's younger brother, and he had been watching her with an intensity that might have been concerning if Sophia did not understand precisely what he was attempting to do. "I am simply standing still," she replied quietly. accepting the drink without intending to consume it. "That is precisely the point," David said with a slight smile. "You are standing still, and that is extraordinary given that most women would be attempting to appear pleased or excited or something approaching appropriate to their circumstances. You are being authentically appropriate, which is considerably more remarkable." "Your brother is looking at me," Sophia observed, not looking toward the Duke but somehow maintaining absolute awareness of his position and trajectory through the room. "My brother is attempting to determine whether his wife is an adequate social performer," David replied. "He has no interest in whether you are actually happy or suffering or anything approaching genuine human emotion. He requires only that you fulfill your function without creating embarrassment." "Then I should be excellent at this," Sophia said, and there was something in her tone that caused David to examine her face more carefully than he had been doing. "Yes," he said finally, "I suspect you will be." By evening, the reception had concluded with the kind of finality that suggested doors closing rather than doors opening. The Duke had remained precisely distant, courteous but cold, present but uninvolved. He had spoken to his bride approximately 3 times, each conversation consisting of social pleasantries that might have been directed toward any acceptable woman of his station. Sophia was assisted into the carriage that would transport them to the Duke's primary residence, Ravensmoor House, located approximately 2 hours' journey from the Merryweather estates. She wore the pale wedding gown still, though it was now wrinkled and beginning to show evidence of the day's emotional labor. The Duke sat across from her in the carriage, a distance of perhaps 6 feet, though it might as well have been 6 miles given the absolute absence of emotional connection that characterized the space between them. "You performed adequately today," he said after approximately 1 hour of complete silence. "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, because no other response was available to her within the parameters of acceptable behavior. "The marriage will proceed as expected," he continued in the tone one might use to discuss the weather. "You will maintain the household. You will produce heirs when the situation requires it. You will not embarrass the family through behavior that suggests you have forgotten your station. Beyond these requirements, you will be permitted to occupy your chambers largely unmolested." "I understand, Your Grace," Sophia said, and in those words existed an entire universe of relief and disappointment that she could not afford to acknowledge. "Excellent," the Duke replied, and then he turned to look out the window, his attention apparently transferred entirely to the darkening landscape beyond the carriage glass. It was not, Sophia thought, the worst marriage settlement in history. It was, in fact, precisely the marriage she had anticipated. The Duke was not interested in her as a person. He was not interested in her thoughts, her experiences, or her capacity for genuine feeling. He required only that she perform the role of Duchess with adequate competence, and that she not trouble him with the messy complications of human emotion, which meant she could remain invisible, which meant she would be safe, which meant that whatever existed beneath the long sleeves could remain concealed, unexplained, and therefore unpitied. Ravensmoor House emerged from the darkness as the carriage approached, a substantial manor that communicated through its very architecture generations of accumulated power and social consequence. It was impressive in the way that significant properties always were, but it was also cold, lacking the kind of warmth that might suggest a place where human connection was possible. A staff of approximately 30 people had been assembled to greet the newly married Duke and Duchess. They stood in careful formation, their faces arranged in expressions of professional respect that communicated nothing of their actual thoughts regarding the marriage or the new Duchess. The Dowager Duchess, the Duke's mother, a woman of approximately 58 years with eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing, observed Sophia's arrival with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether the girl had brought appropriate value to the family or whether she was a regrettable mistake that would require management. "You are the Merryweather daughter," the Dowager Duchess said, without extending her hand in greeting. In the absence of that gesture, Sophia remained where she was, neither approaching nor withdrawing, simply existing in the careful space that formality demanded. "I am, Your Grace," Sophia replied. "I have known your father for 30 years, the Dowager Duchess continued. "He is a man of limited vision and constrained generosity. I trust you have not inherited these limitations." "I hope not, Your Grace," Sophia said, which was neither confirmation nor denial, but rather a kind of neutral acknowledgement that seemed to satisfy the older woman. "Excellent. You will be shown to your chambers. You will rest. Tomorrow, I will orient you to your new responsibilities." The Duke does not appreciate domestic complications, so you will ensure that none arise. It was not a suggestion. It was an instruction delivered with the certainty that instructions would be followed. Sophia acknowledged it with the kind of obedience that transcended any particular individual and seemed to be wired directly into her capacity for functional existence. By the time she was alone in the chambers that would now be her private space, the exhaustion was nearly complete. She removed the wedding gown, a process that required considerable effort given the complexity of the fastening, and replaced it with a nightgown that provided coverage appropriate to her circumstances. She stood before the mirror and observed the stranger who had inhabited her body, the pale woman with the pale hair and the pale eyes, the woman who had learned over the course of 22 years that invisibility was the only form of safety available. The long sleeves of the nightgown extended to her wrists, concealing absolutely the evidence of what existed beneath, the evidence of survival, the evidence of pain that had been so profound it had left permanent markers on her physical form. "You will be excellent at this," she whispered to the reflection, using David's words because they were the only words that seemed to contain any truth. And then she extinguished the lamp and settled into a bed that smelled of unfamiliar linens and the absolute cold of obligation. Sophia discovered, within the first week of her residence at Ravensmoor House, that the Dowager Duchess had not been exaggerating regarding the importance of domestic functionality. The household operated with the kind of precision that suggested it had been constructed by someone who viewed disorder the way a military strategist might view enemy encroachment, something to be prevented at absolutely any cost. "The Duchess takes breakfast at 7, the head housekeeper explained on the morning after Sophia's arrival. "The Duke, when he is in residence, takes breakfast at 7:30. The Dowager Duchess takes breakfast at 8. Luncheon is served at 1. Afternoon tea at 4. Dinner at 8, with port and cigars for the gentlemen in the library afterward at 9:30. And supper?" Sophia asked, attempting to absorb the extraordinary complexity of maintaining a schedule so precisely constructed. "There is no supper," the housekeeper replied, as though Sophia had asked whether the sun rose in the west. "Dinner is sufficient. Additional eating would be considered excessive." The household staff was substantial, but not excessive. There were footmen for specific functions, 1 for the Duke's personal service, 3 for general household requirements. There were housemaids in careful hierarchy: head housemaid, senior housemaids, junior housemaids, scullery maids. There was a cook, a kitchen maid, a butler. There was a lady's maid assigned specifically to Sophia, a woman named Catherine who was approximately 6 years Sophia's senior, and who moved through her work with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested she had learned to be invisible as thoroughly as Sophia had. "The Dowager Duchess is particular about the household," Catherine said, as she arranged Sophia's hair on the morning of her second day. Her hands were capable but gentle, and she worked with the kind of care that suggested she understood, without being told, that Sophia was not accustomed to being touched. "She will observe everything. She will comment on nothing directly, but she will observe." "What will she be observing?" Sophia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Whether you are appropriate," Catherine replied, "whether you are likely to produce heirs, whether you will embarrass the family, whether you are grateful for your position, all of these things continuously, until she is satisfied that her assessment was correct, or until she decides that her assessment was incorrect, and you are therefore a failure requiring remediation." "And the Duke?" Sophia asked. Catherine's hands stilled very slightly in Sophia's hair, not pausing long enough to suggest disapproval, but long enough that Sophia understood the gesture contained meaning. "The Duke is a man who prefers his household to function without requiring his attention," Catherine said carefully. "He does not trouble himself with the details of domestic management. He trusts the Dowager Duchess to maintain standards. Beyond ensuring that the house runs smoothly and that you fulfill your marital obligations when required, he will not be overly concerned with your performance." "Marital obligations," Sophia repeated, and the tone of her voice suggested she was simply confirming the terminology rather than expressing anxiety about the concept. "The Duke is not the sort of man to require excessive attention in that regard," Catherine said, still carefully not making eye contact though her hands remained engaged with Sophia's hair. "He is not interested in the kind of involvement that some men require. He will expect appropriate courtesy and appropriate compliance. He will not expect enthusiasm or genuine participation." This information was conveyed with the kind of delicacy that suggested Catherine was attempting to provide useful guidance without directly suggesting that she had knowledge of the Duke's preferences regarding marital intimacy, knowledge that would have been inappropriate for a lady's maid to possess or to communicate. The first week of Sophia's residence at Ravensmoor House established certain patterns that would, she understood, become the architecture of her life. She rose at 6. She dressed in gowns of appropriate formality, never extremely fashionable, but never suggesting carelessness. She took her meals at the prescribed times. She occupied public spaces with appropriate demeanor. She spoke when spoken to and was otherwise silent. She was, in short, the ideal wife for a man like the Duke of Ravensmoor. On the afternoon of her 7th day, the Duke arrived from town, where he had apparently occupied himself with business matters for several days after the wedding. He wore the kind of tailored coat that suggested he understood perfectly well how to present himself to society, and he moved through his house with the kind of casual authority that suggested he felt no need to question whether his presence was appropriate. "Your Duchess appears to be adequate," he said to his mother, in Sophia's hearing but not to Sophia directly, as though she were a piece of furniture whose performance he was evaluating. "Has she caused any complications?" "None whatsoever," the Dowager Duchess replied. "She has proven to be competent and appropriately deferential. She has not embarrassed us. She appears to understand the expectations of her position." "Excellent," the Duke replied, and then he finally acknowledged Sophia's presence with the kind of nod that one might extend toward an acceptable servant. "Good evening, Duchess. I trust you have settled adequately into your new circumstances." "I have, Your Grace," Sophia replied. "The household is well maintained, the staff is efficient." "That is the responsibility of the Dowager Duchess and the house management staff," he said, with the kind of tone that suggested he was not assigning her credit for competent household management. "Your responsibility is to ensure that you appear appropriately as the Duchess and to prepare yourself for whatever obligations your position might require." "I understand, Your Grace," Sophia said, and nothing in her tone suggested hurt or offense or any emotional engagement whatsoever. The evening progressed, with the kind of formality that had characterized the wedding itself. Dinner was served at 8. The Duke and Dowager Duchess discussed estate management and political developments. Sophia listened and was silent. She consumed the portions of food that were placed before her. She avoided drawing attention to herself in any respect. After dinner, the Duke retired to his library. The Dowager Duchess retired to her chambers. Sophia was left to her own devices, which primarily meant that she returned to her chambers and occupied herself with needlework, a task she approached with the kind of intensity that suggested it was the most important work in the world, rather than the ornamental busy work that it actually was. "The Duke inquired about you," David said, appearing in the drawing room unannounced on the 2nd day of his brother's residence. "Not because he cares how you are managing, but because he wanted confirmation that you were performing your function adequately." "And what did you tell him?" Sophia asked, without looking up from the needlework. "I told him that you were performing remarkably well," David replied, "that you had exceeded expectations, that you appeared to understand perfectly that your primary function was to remain appropriately invisible." "Which was kind," Sophia said, "even if inaccurate." "Why would it be inaccurate?" David asked, settling into the chair across from her, with the kind of familiarity that suggested he had been doing this for months rather than days. "Because being invisible and performing invisibility are not the same thing," Sophia replied. "I have been invisible my entire life. It is simply what I am. But now I am required to perform invisibility, to actively maintain an appearance of appropriateness that prevents anyone from observing the actual person beneath. That performance requires effort. The invisibility that came before required only that I avoid being noticed. The invisibility now requires that I be noticed in precisely the right way." David was silent for a very long moment, and Sophia understood that he had not anticipated this level of complexity in her self-awareness. "You are a remarkable woman," he said finally. "I am a woman who has been trained to be useful," Sophia corrected, "which is considerably less remarkable than you are suggesting." The 2nd week of Sophia's residence produced no particular incidents or complications. The household continued to function with precision. The Duke remained distant but courteous. The Dowager Duchess was satisfied with her daughter-in-law's performance. Society would eventually comment, with the kind of detachment that characterized aristocratic judgment, that the marriage appeared to be appropriately established. But on the afternoon of the 15th day, Something occurred that would eventually alter the fundamental architecture of the marriage. Sophia was occupied with directing the staff in the preparation of the drawing room for an evening reception when a footman, in his haste to move an exceptionally large flower arrangement, inadvertently struck her shoulder with considerable force. The impact caused her to stumble, and as she moved to catch herself, her sleeve, which had been carefully maintained at precisely the length that concealed her forearms, shifted upward. For approximately 3 seconds, perhaps 4, the scarring on her left forearm was visible. The footman did not see it, the other servants did not see it. By the time Sophia could assess her position, the sleeve had returned to its proper position, and the evidence of what lay beneath had been once again concealed. But the Dowager Duchess, who had been entering the drawing room at precisely the moment of the accident, had observed it. She had observed it with the kind of intensity that suggested she was processing information that contradicted her understanding of her daughter-in-law in some fundamental way. She said nothing. She did not comment. She did not inquire. She simply observed Sophia with an expression that suggested she had discovered something that she did not yet fully understand, but which she would eventually investigate with complete thoroughness. "Is something required, Your Grace?" Sophia asked, because the silence had extended long enough that it demanded some form of acknowledgement. "No," the Dowager Duchess replied. "Nothing is required. Carry on with your preparations." But her eyes did not leave Sophia's arms. The evening reception occurred as planned, attended by approximately 150 people of appropriate social standing. Sophia performed her role as hostess with the kind of perfection that suggested she had been born to the position rather than thrust into it 17 days prior. She smiled appropriately. She conversed with appropriate brevity. She ensured that guests were attended to with appropriate courtesy. She wore a gown with long sleeves, despite the warmth of the room filled with so many people. She wore long gloves despite the fact that longer gloves were not strictly necessary for the occasion. She positioned herself in such a manner that her arms were never fully visible without the layers of fabric that protected them from observation. The Duke, observing his wife throughout the evening, noted her competence but did not appear to question it. He had instructed her to perform the function of Duchess adequately, and she was performing it. That was all that was required or expected. But the Dowager Duchess observed more carefully than her son. She observed Sophia's consistent repositioning of sleeves. She observed the way Sophia avoided activities that would have required removing her gloves or positioning her arms in ways that might expose what lay beneath. She observed, in short, a woman engaged in continuous, systematic concealment. And she began to form theories regarding what precisely was being concealed and why. By the 3rd week of Sophia's residence, the Dowager Duchess had developed sufficient conviction regarding her theories that she began to communicate them to her son with subtle precision. "Your wife is a woman of considerable reserve," she observed one evening as she and her son took tea together. "Yes," the Duke replied, with the kind of agreement that suggested he saw nothing unusual about a wife being reserved. "That is appropriate. It is not the function of a wife to trouble her husband with excessive conversation or emotional demands." "Precisely," the Dowager Duchess said, "but one wonders whether such extreme reserve might be hiding something. One wonders whether a woman who is quite so determined to remain out of notice might be hiding something rather more problematic than simple modesty." "Such as what?" the Duke asked, and the tone of his voice suggested he was not genuinely interested in the answer, but was willing to humor his mother's tendency toward speculation. "One does not like to speculate," the Dowager Duchess said, which was precisely what she was about to do. "But there are certain behaviors that are consistent with particular forms of disturbance. The constant wearing of long sleeves despite weather conditions that would ordinarily make such clothing uncomfortable. The positioning of the arms in ways that prevent clear visibility. The way she touches her own arms, as though verifying they remain covered. These are behaviors consistent with self-harm, Your Grace. These are the behaviors of a woman who has deliberately injured herself." The Duke set down his teacup with the kind of deliberate care that suggested he was processing information that did not align with his understanding. "That is an extraordinary accusation," he said finally. "I am not accusing," the Dowager Duchess replied. "I am observing, and I am suggesting that you might want to inquire regarding your wife's past. A woman who engages in self-harm is a woman who has experienced disturbance severe enough to lead her to injure her own body. That is the kind of disturbance that produces complications. That is the kind of disturbance that produces unpredictable behavior." The marriage was arranged through proper channels, the Duke said. Her father represented her circumstances. There was no indication of any disturbance. Her father, the Dowager Duchess said with the kind of tone that conveyed absolute distrust, is a man interested in resolving his financial circumstances through advantageous marriage. He would not volunteer information regarding his daughter's complications. He would represent her as adequate and hope that the complications do not become apparent until after the marriage was finalized and therefore irreversible. The Duke did not respond immediately. He returned to his tea, and in his silence existed a conversation about whether his mother's speculations had merit or whether she was engaging in the kind of unfounded theorizing that frequently characterized her interactions with her daughter-in-law. But the question had been raised, and once raised it was not easy to dismiss. The Duke began, in his careful and controlled way, to observe his wife with considerably more attention than he had previously directed toward her. He observed her eating habits. She consumed food with appropriate moderation, but without apparent pleasure. He observed her movement through the household, always purposeful, never relaxed. He observed her interactions with the staff, always correct, never warm. He observed her sleeping habits. She apparently did not sleep well, given the dark circles that appeared beneath her eyes with increasing frequency as the weeks progressed. But most of all, he observed her arms. She never, in any circumstance, allowed her arms to be fully visible. When she rose in the morning and Catherine was dressing her, she kept her arms covered. When she took meals, she kept her arms positioned in such a way that the fabric remained intact. When she was alone, or when she believed she was alone, she would touch her own arms with a gesture that seemed to be one of verification or reassurance. By the 4th week of the marriage, the Duke had developed sufficient curiosity that he began to construct reasons to observe his wife more carefully. He arrived at breakfast earlier than was his custom. He walked through the household at unexpected times. He found reasons to be present in spaces where she was likely to be. And on the afternoon of the 29th day of the marriage, he encountered her in the conservatory, occupied with the arrangement of flowers, a task that required her to position her arms in a way that was unavoidable. She was wearing a gown with relatively shorter sleeves than she ordinarily wore, and as she reached toward the upper shelves of the arrangement, the fabric shifted. The Duke saw, for the space of perhaps 2 seconds, what she had been so systematically concealing. The scars were not subtle. They covered, from what he could observe, a significant portion of her forearm and extended upward onto her upper arm. Some appeared to be burn scars, the kind that came from contact with heat. Others appeared to be linear scars, the kind that came from cutting or sharp objects. And in that moment, the Duke understood that his mother's speculation regarding self-harm had likely been accurate. What he did not understand was why. The Duke's approach was methodical and controlled, which was precisely the way he approached every aspect of his life. He did not confront Sophia immediately. Instead, he spent 3 days considering whether to address the matter at all, weighing whether his wife's potential disturbance was a complication sufficient to require active intervention. By the 4th day, he had arrived at the conclusion that the marriage, which had been thus far appropriately functional, might be complicated by a wife who was engaging in harmful behavior, and a complicated marriage was worse, from his perspective, than an uncomplicated marriage, even if the uncomplicated marriage was based on concealment. He requested that Sophia meet him in his private chambers, a request that she understood, though neither of them articulated it directly, was not optional. She arrived at the appointed time, wearing a gown with long sleeves and gloves, as though she understood on some fundamental level that this meeting was going to require every layer of protection that she could construct. "Sit," the Duke said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat, and the posture she adopted was one of someone prepared to endure judgment without defense. "I require you to be honest with me regarding a matter of some significance," the Duke said, and his tone was not cruel, but it was absolutely final. "I have observed evidence that you are concealing injuries or scarring on your arms. I wish to know the origin of these scars and the reason for your systematic concealment of them." Sophia's face did not change, but her hands, which had been resting on her lap, became fists. "I am entitled to my privacy regarding certain matters," she said finally. "No," the Duke replied with absolute certainty. "You are not. You are my wife. Your physical and mental state is my concern, particularly if your mental state is such that you are engaging in behavior harmful to yourself." "I am not engaging in self-harm," Sophia said, and the tone of her voice suggested she was providing information rather than defending herself. The scars are not self-inflicted. They are a result of circumstances beyond my control. Whose control, then? The Duke asked. Who inflicted these injuries? Sophia was silent for a very long time. The silence extended long enough that the Duke began to wonder whether she would speak at all, whether she would simply remain silent and force him to make assumptions based on incomplete information. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "My mother," she said. "Margaret Catherine Merriweather inflicted the scars on my arms when I was 17 years old." The Duke processed this information with the kind of care that suggested he was attempting to understand precisely what she was communicating. "Your mother deliberately burned and cut you," he said, as though confirming something that was not fully comprehensible. "Yes," Sophia replied. "Why?" the Duke asked. "Because," Sophia said slowly, "she believed that my hands would not be satisfactory for the purposes of marriage. She believed that I was becoming too capable, too independent, too willing to engage in activities that did not conform to her understanding of appropriate femininity, and so she decided to teach me that capability was not valuable, that independence was not acceptable, that my value as a person was limited to my capacity to be decorative and obedient." The Duke was very silent. "She accomplished her objective," Sophia continued. "I became very careful about what I could do with my hands. I became very aware of the visibility of my arms. I became very understanding of the fact that my value in society depended on my ability to conceal the evidence of my own damage, and I became very skilled at remaining invisible." "How old were you when this occurred?" the Duke asked. 17, Sophia replied. "My mother died 3 years ago. The scars, as you have observed, have not faded. They will not fade. They are permanent reminders that the person beneath the skin is not the person that society requires me to be." The Duke rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back towards Sophia as he processed what he had been told. His hands were clenched at his sides, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was engaged in the kind of emotional control that required physical effort to maintain. "Why did you not inform me of this prior to the marriage?" he asked finally, still not turning to face her. "Because," Sophia replied, "the information would have changed nothing regarding the necessity of the marriage. My father would still have required financial resolution. Your family would still have required a wife. I would still have been the only available option that satisfied both requirements. The revelation of my scars would only have complicated matters without changing the fundamental reality of the situation." The Duke turned to face her, and his expression was complicated, not angry, but something that transcended anger. It was the expression of a man who had received information that required him to reevaluate something fundamental about his circumstances. "Your wife," Sophia said quietly, "is a woman who was systematically damaged by her mother in service of ensuring her own compliance and control. That is a fact that cannot be changed by revelation, but the concealment of that fact allowed you to proceed with the marriage without requiring you to process the knowledge that your bride was a woman carrying profound trauma." "And now that I know?" the Duke asked. "Now you must decide whether to proceed with the marriage as though nothing has changed, or whether this revelation constitutes grounds for the dissolution of the arrangement," Sophia replied. "I suspect most men in your position would choose the latter." The Duke was silent for a very long time. "I will not," he said finally, "dissolve the marriage, but I will require that you cease to conceal your arms in my private presence. I will require that you acknowledge, at least within the privacy of this household, that you are a woman who has experienced trauma, and that trauma does not constitute evidence of personal failure or inadequacy." "That is an unusual requirement," Sophia said. "Yes," the Duke agreed, "but then I suspect I am proving to be an unusual Duke. Now leave. I require time to process this information without additional conversation." Sophia rose and moved toward the door. "And, Duchess," the Duke said, causing her to pause, "your mother was, from the information you have provided, a woman of profound cruelty. I am—" He paused, as though searching for appropriate language. "I am sorry that you experienced such treatment." Sophia did not respond. She simply departed, leaving the Duke alone with the knowledge that his wife was a woman whose arms concealed a history of deliberate injury, and that this knowledge was now permanently embedded in his understanding of who she was. The following morning, the Duke did not appear at breakfast. The Dowager Duchess observed his absence with the kind of speculation that suggested she was constructing theories about what might have occurred between her son and his wife. But by afternoon, the Duke had emerged from his chambers, and his demeanor had shifted in ways that were subtle but observable. He was not warmer, precisely, But he was no longer maintaining the perfect distance that had characterized the early weeks of the marriage. "You will take tea with me this afternoon," he said to Sophia, with the kind of tone that was not optional, in the small drawing room at 3 o'clock. When she arrived at the appointed time, she found him already present, occupying the chair near the window. He observed her as she entered, and his observation was different than it had been previously, not cold, but careful, as though he was attempting to see something that had not been previously visible to him. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you revealed to me yesterday. I have been thinking about the implications of what you experienced, and what that experience means regarding your circumstances now." "Yes, Your Grace," Sophia replied, because some form of acknowledgement seemed to be required. "You have lived your entire adult life concealing yourself," he continued. "You have constructed an identity designed to be invisible and acceptable. You have married a man who did not require you to be anything other than appropriately functional. And in doing so, you have exchanged one form of constraint for another." "That is accurate," Sophia acknowledged, "but it is also better than the previous arrangement." "Better is not the same as good," the Duke said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was not simply engaging in conversation, but was expressing a kind of conviction regarding this fact. "I am not interested in a wife who is simply better than her previous circumstances. I am not interested in a woman who has learned to be invisible as a form of survival. I am interested in understanding what you might become if you were permitted to be something other than invisible." "I do not understand what you are suggesting, Your Grace," Sophia said. "I am suggesting," the Duke replied, "that within the privacy of this household, and specifically within my presence, you will cease to conceal yourself. You will remove the long sleeves. You will wear the shorter gloves. You will acknowledge, at least in private, that you are a woman who has been damaged, and that this damage does not constitute evidence of personal inadequacy." "And what will you do with this knowledge?" Sophia asked. "What will you do when you see the evidence of my mother's cruelty on my skin?" "I do not know," the Duke replied, with the kind of honesty that suggested he was being truthful about his uncertainty. "But I suspect I will do what any person does when confronted with the visible evidence of another's suffering. I will recognize it, acknowledge it, and decide whether to allow that recognition to change the way I understand the person before me." Over the subsequent weeks, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic between the Duke and his wife. He did not become warm, precisely, but he became engaged. He began to ask questions about her childhood, her experiences, her understanding of the events that had formed her. And she, recognizing that genuine honesty was being invited rather than merely tolerated, began to share information about herself that she had never previously articulated. She removed the long sleeves in his private presence, and he observed the scarring without comment or visible distress. He began to touch her arms, not with pity but with a kind of calm acknowledgement that seemed to communicate acceptance rather than condemnation. The household staff observed the changes with the kind of careful attention that servants always apply to understanding the fundamental nature of relationships that determine whether their positions are secure. The Dowager Duchess observed the changes with the kind of uncertainty that suggested her initial theories regarding self-harm were proving to be inaccurate, and that she was uncertain what to make of a daughter-in-law who was becoming increasingly visible rather than increasingly invisible. David, observing the transformation, said to his brother one evening, "You are changing her." "I am not changing her," the Duke replied. "I am simply ceasing to require her to conceal what she already is." "That is not the same thing," David replied. "You are revealing her, and in revealing her you are transforming her understanding of what is possible." And perhaps the Duke thought but did not say, that was precisely what marriage could be. Not obligation or transaction, but the quiet work of two damaged people choosing day by day to see each other truly and to accept what they saw without demanding that it be different. By June 22nd, exactly 2 months from the wedding ceremony that had felt like a transaction rather than a beginning, something fundamental had shifted in the way that Sophia and Alexander occupied the same spaces. The drawing room no longer felt like a room where two people were maintaining polite distance. It felt like a room where two people were attempting to understand whether intimacy was possible. The Duke, Alexander, she was learning to call him in private, though the formality of Your Grace remained the architecture of their public existence, had begun a practice of taking evening tea with her in his private chambers. These were not ceremonial teas. They were conversations, real conversations, the kind that required both participants to be present rather than performing. "Your mother," Alexander said one evening, as they sat in the quiet of his library with the fire casting shadows across the room, "was she always cruel, or did the cruelty develop over time?" Sophia had learned, over the past weeks, that he asked these questions not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a genuine desire to understand the architecture of her experience. "She was always controlling," Sophia replied carefully. "But the deliberate cruelty, the burning and cutting that began when I was approximately 17, I believe she perceived that I was becoming too independent, that my hands, which she had always wanted to be delicate and decorative, were becoming capable of doing things that suggested strength rather than fragility. So she attempted to damage your capability by damaging your hands," Alexander said, and the tone of his voice suggested he was processing this information as a logical progression rather than as an incomprehensible act. "Yes," Sophia confirmed. "The burns were severe enough that the scarring was permanent. The cutting was methodical enough that I understood the message being communicated. My value was not in my capability, but in my appearance. My hands should not do things. They should simply exist as decoration." "And you have spent 5 years concealing them as though her message was accurate," Alexander observed. "I have spent 5 years surviving," Sophia corrected. "The concealment was part of the survival. If no one could see the evidence of the damage, no one would ask questions. If no one asked questions, I could construct a life that was functional." "And now?" Alexander asked. "Now I'm attempting to understand whether a functional life is sufficient," Sophia replied, "or whether functionality without authenticity is simply another form of invisibility." It was on the evening of June 23rd that the Duke requested something that represented a fundamental crossing of the boundary that had existed between them. He requested that she come to his chambers, not for conversation, but for consummation, not as obligation, but as something approaching genuine intimacy. She arrived wearing a nightgown, her arms visible for the first time without the constraint of sleeves or gloves. The scars were evident in the candlelight, burn marks creating patterns of discoloration across her skin, linear scars creating lines that seemed to map her suffering onto her physical form. Alexander observed her without looking away, and in his steady observation existed an entire communication about acceptance that transcended words. "You are beautiful," he said, and the words were not flattery but observation. "The scars do not diminish that. They simply communicate that you are a woman who has survived something that would have destroyed most people." "I do not feel beautiful," Sophia replied. "I feel marked." "Yes," Alexander agreed. "You are marked by survival. That is a form of beauty that society does not typically acknowledge, but it is beauty nonetheless." What occurred between them was not the perfunctory obligation that had characterized their first week of marriage. It was something that approached genuine connection. Alexander moved slowly, with a kind of care that suggested he understood that her body was territory that had been violated, and that any movement within that territory required permission and consciousness. He touched her arms, not avoiding the scars, but acknowledging them. He kissed her wrists, where the burning had been most severe. He communicated through every gesture that the evidence of her suffering was not something to be ashamed of or concealed, but something to be acknowledged and accepted. And Sophia, who had spent 5 years training herself to be passive and compliant, discovered that genuine intimacy required a kind of activity that she had not anticipated. She discovered that her body could respond to being truly seen. That vulnerability, paradoxically, could be a form of strength. "Thank you," she whispered afterward, as they lay together in the darkness of the chamber. "For what?" Alexander asked. "For not looking away," she replied. "For seeing me completely and not demanding that I be different." "I will never demand that you be different," Alexander said, and in his voice existed a kind of promise that transcended conventional marital obligation. "I will only continue to insist that you stop demanding it of yourself." By the morning of June 24th, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sophia moved through the household with a quality of presence that suggested something fundamental had shifted. The Dowager Duchess observed this change with the kind of uncertainty that suggested her theories regarding her daughter-in-law required substantial revision. "Something has changed," the Dowager Duchess said to her son, with the kind of directness that characterized her approach to information she did not yet fully understand. "Yes," Alexander replied. "My wife has begun to understand that survival is not the only objective that a life can pursue." "That is cryptic," the Dowager Duchess observed. "I prefer clarity. "Then I will be clear," Alexander replied. "I have discovered that my wife is a woman of considerable strength and intelligence, and I have decided that she deserves to understand that the damage that was inflicted upon her does not define her value or her capability." The Dowager Duchess was silent, and in her silence existed the kind of reassessment that suggested her daughter-in-law had somehow managed, in the span of 2 months, to transform the fundamental dynamic of her position within the household. On the morning of June 25th, Sophia discovered something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her husband. She had risen early, as was her custom, and had moved through the household with her ordinary, quiet efficiency. But when she encountered Alexander in his private study, she observed that his right hand was bleeding. The bleeding was not dramatic, but it was sufficient to suggest that something significant had occurred. The knuckles on his hand, which she had observed over the past weeks and which bore scars from previous injury, had reopened. "What has occurred?" she asked, moving toward him with the kind of directness that suggested she had moved beyond the formality that had previously governed her approach to addressing him. "Nothing of consequence," Alexander replied, but his attempt to conceal the hand suggested that the injury was, in fact, of consequence. "You are bleeding," Sophia said. "That is either consequence or you are ignoring evidence of consequence. Neither suggests that I should accept your assertion that nothing has occurred." Alexander was silent for a moment, and then he extended his hand toward her. The palm bore scarring that was more recent than the scarring on his knuckles. The scar ran across the width of the palm, suggesting it had been inflicted with deliberate precision. "This is recent," Sophia observed. "Within the past year, I would estimate." "What created this injury?" "A knife," Alexander replied, with the kind of simplicity that suggested he was stating fact rather than explanation. "A man attempted to use a knife against me approximately 8 months ago. The result of that encounter is visible on my hand." "Why would a man attempt to use a knife against you?" Sophia asked. "Because," Alexander replied, "I was attempting to prevent him from doing something that I believed was morally wrong, and he disagreed with my assessment of what was moral and what was not." Sophia observed the scar more carefully. It was deliberate enough to suggest that Alexander had not simply fallen into conflict passively. It was severe enough to suggest that the conflict had been genuine rather than theoretical. "I wish you to tell me everything," she said finally. "Everything about your hands, everything about the violence that has marked your life, because I have shared my damage with you. It seems only appropriate that you should share yours with me." Alexander set down his pen with careful precision, and his expression suggested he was making a decision about whether to honor her request or whether to maintain the boundaries that he had, until this point, preserved around his own history. "My father," he said slowly, "was a man who believed that discipline should be physical rather than intellectual. He believed that boys should be trained through pain rather than through conversation, and he believed that his sons existed for the purpose of establishing his lineage, not for the purpose of developing into individuals with their own thoughts and perspectives." Sophia remained silent, sensing that interruption would prevent him from continuing. "I was approximately 16 years old when I first attempted to prevent my father from inflicting punishment on David," Alexander continued. "David had disobeyed an instruction regarding his coursework at school. My father was preparing to use a belt to educate David regarding the importance of obedience, and I positioned myself between them." "And your father struck you instead," Sophia said, understanding the progression without requiring explicit articulation. "My father struck me repeatedly," Alexander corrected, "for what he perceived as insubordination, for what he perceived as an attempt to undermine his authority. And the scars that you observe on my knuckles are from the occasions when I defended myself, when I refused to accept that his authority was legitimate." "Your mother permitted this?" Sophia asked. "My mother did not have the capacity to prevent it," Alexander replied. "She was not a woman of physical strength, and my father was not a man who responded to rational argument regarding his approach to child-rearing, so my mother endured. And David and I learned that physical survival required that we be willing to fight." "And the scar on your palm?" Sophia asked. "The recent injury?" "That is more complicated," Alexander replied. "Approximately 8 months ago, I discovered that a man employed by my family was engaging in behavior toward a servant girl that was not consensual. I informed him that his employment was terminated. He disagreed with my assessment. He attempted to prevent me from leaving the situation. And in the course of that encounter, a knife was involved." "You fought him," Sophia said. Yes, Alexander confirmed. I fought him, and I won the encounter. He no longer works for this family. The servant girl was provided with resources to relocate and establish herself in circumstances of her choosing, and I acquired a scar that occasionally reopens when I exert myself physically. Sophia reached out and took his hand, examining the scarring with the kind of care that suggested she was cataloguing every detail of what was visible to her. We are both, she said finally, people who have been damaged by circumstances beyond our control. You by your father's cruelty, I by my mother's cruelty, and yet we have both survived. And more than surviving, we have both made choices regarding how we would treat others once we possessed the capacity to determine our own actions. That is accurate, Alexander agreed, though I suspect most people would not have arrived at that conclusion. Then perhaps, Sophia replied, we are not most people. Perhaps we are two people who have been broken by the same fundamental reality, that the people who are supposed to protect us are sometimes the people who inflict the greatest damage, and who have decided separately and then together that this reality does not have to determine how we treat the people who come after us. She brought his hand to her lips and kissed the scar on his palm, and in that gesture existed an entire communication about understanding that transcended words. David arrived at Ravensmoor House on the afternoon of June 26th without announcement, a development that suggested something had motivated his sudden appearance with sufficient urgency that formality could be dispensed with. He found his brother in the library, occupied with estate correspondence, and he closed the door behind him with a deliberateness that communicated that the conversation that was about to occur was not suitable for general household observation. I have been hearing rumors in town, David said without preamble, regarding developments in your marriage to Miss Merriweather. Specifically, I have been hearing rumors that suggest you have discovered something about her that would ordinarily constitute grounds for profound complications. I have come to determine whether these rumors are accurate or whether they represent the kind of speculation that society engages in when it possesses insufficient information. What rumors specifically? Alexander asked, with the kind of tone that suggested he already knew the answer and was simply confirming the details. Rumors that your wife bears scarring on her arms consistent with deliberate injury, David replied. Rumors that suggest she is a woman of profound disturbance who was married to you without your full awareness of her circumstances. Rumors that you have discovered her concealment and are now attempting to determine how to manage the complications that her damage might produce. Alexander was silent, and his silence communicated that the rumors, if not entirely accurate, were close enough to accurate that he could not defend against them with denial. They are not rumors, Alexander said finally. They are, in fact, accurate in their broad strokes, though the implications that you are drawing from the rumors are substantially less accurate than the rumors themselves. Then explain, David demanded. Because from my perspective, it appears that you have married a woman of unclear mental and physical stability, and you are now attempting to normalize her circumstances as though her damage is simply an interesting characteristic rather than evidence of something more problematic. Her damage, Alexander replied coldly, was inflicted by her mother when she was 17 years old. It was not self-inflicted. It was deliberate and systematic, and it was designed to damage her confidence in her own capability as punishment for developing the kind of independence that her mother found objectionable. David went very still, and in his stillness existed the kind of processing that suggested he was re-evaluating something fundamental about his understanding of the situation. Her mother did that, he said finally, not as a question but as a confirmation. Yes, Alexander confirmed, and her mother is deceased, so the woman responsible for her damage is no longer in a position to inflict additional harm. But the damage that was inflicted remains visible, and my wife has spent the past 5 years concealing that damage as though it constituted evidence of personal failure rather than evidence of maternal cruelty. And you have discovered this, David said, and you have decided that the discovery changes the fundamental nature of your marriage from obligation to something approaching genuine partnership. That is accurate, Alexander confirmed. David moved to the window and was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. I knew her before you married her, he said. Not well and not in circumstances that would ordinarily be appropriate for an unmarried gentleman to be acquainted with a woman who would become his brother's wife. But I knew her, and I knew because she told me what had occurred on her arms. And I have been waiting for the past 2 months to observe whether you would discover the truth or whether she would continue to conceal it. You knew, Alexander said, and the tone of his voice suggested he was processing a level of complication that he had not previously anticipated. I knew, David confirmed, because approximately 6 months ago, I was traveling through Bath on business, and I encountered her in circumstances that allowed for conversation, and she was sufficiently distressed by something that had occurred that she revealed the truth to me, a stranger, an inappropriate revelation that suggested she was struggling with the weight of concealment. Why did you not inform me prior to the marriage? Alexander asked. Because, David replied, it was not my information to share. If she had chosen to inform you, that would have been her decision and her timing. My responsibility was to observe whether you would treat her with the kind of respect that her circumstances required, or whether you would treat her as though her damage constituted evidence of inadequacy. And your assessment? Alexander asked. My assessment, David replied, turning to face his brother, is that you are proving to be a better man than I anticipated you were capable of being. You have discovered her damage. You have responded not with judgment, but with compassion. And you have, in some fundamental way, begun the process of helping her understand that survival does not require perpetual concealment. She is a remarkable woman, Alexander said. The damage that was inflicted upon her does not diminish that. It simply demonstrates her capacity for resilience. It demonstrates considerably more than that, David replied. It demonstrates a woman who has been trained to be invisible and who is, through your acceptance, beginning to understand that visibility is not necessarily equivalent to danger. Sophia discovered on the morning of June 27th that David had been present at Ravensmoor House for the past day without her having been aware of his presence. The discovery occurred when she encountered him in the breakfast room, occupied with the kind of casual attention to toast and marmalade that suggested he had been residing in the house long enough that informality had replaced the formality of formal guest status. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," he said, using her title in a way that suggested deliberate formality. "I trust you slept adequately." "I was unaware that you were present at the house," Sophia replied, moving to take her customary position at the table with the kind of careful precision that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with his presence. "Yes," David agreed. "Alexander and I have been engaged in conversation regarding matters that required privacy and deliberation. I only arrived yesterday afternoon." Sophia poured her tea with steady hands, and there was something in her composure that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the implications of what David's presence and explanation meant regarding what conversations had occurred. "Have those conversations concluded?" she asked finally. "Yes," David replied, "and I believe that the conclusions that have been reached are appropriate and necessary." "I do not understand," Sophia said, and there was an edge to her voice that suggested her comfort with being discussed without her participation was limited. "No," David agreed. "You do not understand because the conversation that occurred between your husband and myself was conducted for the purpose of determining my position regarding his marriage to you, given certain information that I possessed regarding your circumstances." Sophia set down her teacup with careful precision, and her expression shifted from uncertain to something that approximated understanding. "You know," she said simply. "I do," David confirmed. "I know about your arms. I know about what your mother did to you. I know because you told me 6 months ago in Bath, in circumstances that would ordinarily have been inappropriate, but which, given the distress you were experiencing, seemed necessary." "Why did you not inform Alexander prior to the marriage?" Sophia asked, and the question was directed to David with the kind of intensity that suggested she understood the implications of what he was communicating. "Because," David replied carefully, "the information belonged to you to share, not to me. I waited to observe whether you would choose to reveal the truth or whether you would perpetually conceal it. And I waited to observe how Alexander would respond if he discovered what you had been concealing." "And?" Sophia prompted. "And I have concluded," David said, "that my brother is proving to be a man capable of genuine compassion, that he has responded to your revelation not with judgment but with acceptance, and that you are in turn beginning to understand that vulnerability is not equivalent to weakness." Sophia was silent for a very long time, and in her silence existed the kind of processing that suggested she was evaluating David with considerably more complexity than she had previously afforded him. "You have known me for 6 months, she said finally, "during which time you have observed my marriage to your brother. You have waited for the revelation of what I have been concealing, and you have presented yourself this morning with the knowledge that I understand precisely what role you have played in the events that have transpired. That is accurate, David confirmed. I do not know whether to be grateful or to feel violated, Sophia said. I do not know whether your intervention on my behalf constitutes protection or intrusion. Perhaps, David replied, it constitutes something that transcends that dichotomy. Perhaps it is simply recognition that you are a woman of considerable value who deserves to be treated with the kind of respect and acceptance that most people would never think to offer someone carrying the kind of damage that you carry. And now, Sophia asked, what is your intention regarding the knowledge that you possess? Do you intend to allow me to navigate my marriage without additional interference? I intend, David replied, to allow you to make your own decisions regarding who knows what information about your circumstances, but I would suggest that concealment, which was necessary for survival, may no longer be necessary now that you are in circumstances where visibility does not constitute danger. The conversation that occurred between Alexander and Sophia on the evening of June 27th was marked by a kind of careful deliberation that suggested both participants understood that something fundamental was being negotiated. David informed me that he knew about your arms before I married you, Sophia said, not accusatory but simply providing information. Yes, Alexander confirmed, and I have asked him to maintain the confidence that you shared with him, because the information belongs to you, to share or conceal as you determine appropriate. I no longer wish to conceal it, Sophia said, and the words seemed to cost her something, as though saying them aloud created a kind of permanence that she was simultaneously resisting and desiring. What does that mean? Alexander asked. That you no longer wish to conceal the information about your arms, or that you no longer wish to conceal the person who lives beneath the physical manifestation of your damage? Both, Sophia replied. I am tired of being invisible. I am tired of performing the role of wife without being the woman who occupies the role. I am tired of concealment. Then you will not conceal, Alexander said, at least not within these walls, at least not with me. And we will determine together what revelation is appropriate in other contexts. The Dowager Duchess will require explanation, Sophia observed. She will have theories regarding what the scars represent, and some of those theories will be accurate, while others will be based on assumptions and judgments. Yes, Alexander agreed, and when she inquires, we will provide explanation, not because she is entitled to it, but because you have chosen that visibility is preferable to concealment. If visibility is truly your choice, then you must be willing to endure the consequences of being seen. I am not certain that I am willing, Sophia said, but I am becoming convinced that the alternative, perpetual invisibility, is the kind of existence that does not constitute living, merely surviving. On the morning of June 28th, approximately 3 months from her wedding day, Sophia descended to breakfast wearing a gown with sleeves that terminated at her wrists rather than extending to conceal her forearms. The scarring was visible, not dramatically displayed but not concealed. The Dowager Duchess observed the transformation with the kind of attention that suggested she had been waiting for this revelation. I believe, the Dowager Duchess said with the kind of directness that had come to characterize her approach to communication with her daughter-in-law, that you have chosen to reveal something that you have previously been at considerable effort to conceal. Yes, Sophia confirmed. I have decided that concealment was a strategy for survival that is no longer necessary in my current circumstances. The scars are the result of deliberate injury, the Dowager Duchess said. Not a question. An observation. Yes, Sophia confirmed. They were inflicted by my mother when I was 17 years old. They represent her attempt to damage my capability in service of maintaining her control over my actions and my understanding of my own value. The Dowager Duchess was silent, and in her silence existed the kind of reassessment that suggested she was processing information that required substantial revision of her understanding. Your mother was a woman of profound cruelty, she said finally. Yes, Sophia agreed, but she is deceased now, and I have discovered that the damage she inflicted does not have to define the person I become. That survival can be something more than simply concealing the evidence of what we have endured. By the end of June, the transformation had become apparent to everyone within the household. Sophia moved through the estate with a kind of presence that suggested she was no longer attempting to be invisible. She wore her scars without shame. She engaged in conversation without the careful monitoring that had previously characterized her interactions. She was, in short, becoming visible. And in becoming visible, she was discovering that the world did not collapse, that acceptance was possible, that two people, both bearing the marks of trauma, could construct something approaching genuine partnership. "I would like to establish a charitable initiative," she said to Alexander one evening, as they occupied the conservatory in the quiet hour before dinner. "An initiative designed to provide resources and support for women who have experienced deliberate injury at the hands of family members, not as something hidden or shameful, but as something recognized and addressed." "That is revolutionary," Alexander replied, and the tone of his voice suggested approval rather than warning. "Yes," Sophia agreed, "but then I am beginning to understand that my entire existence has become revolutionary. That transformation from invisibility to visibility is by its very nature a kind of revolution." And Alexander, observing his wife as she spoke about her vision for change, recognized something that had not been visible to him on their wedding day, that he had not married a woman who required saving. He had married a woman who was already in the process of saving herself. His role was simply to refrain from requiring her to remain invisible, to accept her visibility, and to use whatever power he possessed to support her vision for transformation. The dinner reception held on the evening of June 29th was, by all conventional standards, an ordinary assembly of the gentry and minor nobility that constituted the social circle of the Duke of Ravensmore. Approximately 80 people had been invited, a number substantial enough to require careful management of space and resources, but not so numerous as to suggest that the occasion was anything other than routine household entertainment. Sophia descended the grand staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that had been selected with careful deliberation. The gown was, in all respects, appropriate to her station and the formality of the occasion, but the sleeves terminated at her wrists rather than extending to conceal her forearms. The scarring was visible to anyone who cared to observe it. The moment of her appearance created a subtle disruption in the rhythm of conversation that preceded dinner. Not a dramatic disruption. The assembled company was too well trained in the performance of social propriety to permit anything approaching open reaction, but a disruption nonetheless. A momentary pause in the flow of interaction that communicated that something unexpected had been observed. Lady Pembroke, a woman of approximately 60 years who had known the Merryweather family for decades, approached Sophia with the kind of careful courtesy that suggested she had constructed a response to what she had observed. "Your Grace," Lady Pembroke said, with a slight inclination of her head that fell short of a full curtsy, "the scarring on your arms is quite visible this evening. One wonders whether this is intentional or the result of an inadvertent oversight in your choice of wardrobe." "It is entirely intentional," Sophia replied, with the kind of calm that suggested she had anticipated this inquiry and had prepared her response with considerable care. "I have chosen to cease concealing the evidence of my history. The scarring is permanent and visible. I have decided that attempting to conceal permanent evidence of one's survival is a form of dishonesty that I am no longer willing to perpetuate." "How extraordinarily unusual," Lady Pembroke observed, and the tone of her voice suggested that she was attempting to determine whether Sophia was engaging in a form of behavior that constituted revolutionary action or whether she was demonstrating signs of disturbance. "Yes," Sophia agreed, "it is unusual. Most women who bear evidence of damage attempt to conceal it, as I did for the first several months of my marriage. But I have concluded that concealment requires a kind of energy and vigilance that I can no longer justify dedicating to the maintenance of appearances." The dinner progressed with a quality of tension that suggested the assembled company was attempting to understand precisely what Sophia's visible scarring represented. Were they evidence of self-harm, evidence of accident, evidence of something darker? Alexander, observing his wife throughout the evening, noted that she did not attempt to conceal her arms through positioning or gesture. She did not wear longer gloves. She did not attempt to minimize the visibility of the scarring. She simply existed with her damage visible, answering questions when asked and not offering explanation when not inquired. By the time the gentlemen had withdrawn for port and cigars, Sophia had been the subject of considerable speculation and observation, and by the time they returned to the drawing-room, the narrative regarding the Duchess of Ravensmore had begun to shift from speculation regarding damage toward recognition of something more complex, a woman who had chosen visibility over concealment. "You are becoming something of a scandal," Alexander said quietly when they had returned to their private chambers late in the evening. The assembled company has spent the evening constructing narratives regarding your scarring. Some believe you are engaging in demonstration of disturbance. Others believe you are engaging in demonstration of extraordinary courage. Which narrative do you prefer? Sophia asked. I prefer, Alexander replied, the narrative that acknowledges that you are simply a woman who has decided that your damage does not require permanent concealment, that you have chosen visibility not as demonstration, but as acknowledgement, that survival is not the same as shame. The Dowager Duchess observed everything, Sophia noted. I suspect she will require conversation regarding what occurred this evening. Yes, Alexander agreed. She will require conversation. And you will have the opportunity to determine what information you wish to share and what information you wish to maintain as private. The Dowager Duchess requested a private audience with Sophia on the morning of June 30th. The request was delivered through the household staff with enough formality that it constituted something approaching command rather than simple invitation. Sophia understood that the time for avoiding direct conversation regarding her visible scarring had concluded. She found her mother-in-law in the morning room, occupied with correspondence that she set aside with deliberate precision as Sophia entered. You have chosen to display your scarring, the Dowager Duchess said without preamble. I will assume this choice was deliberate, rather than the result of carelessness in wardrobe selection. Yes, Sophia confirmed, it was deliberate. I have decided that concealment is no longer necessary in my circumstances. The display is inappropriate, the Dowager Duchess replied. It suggests to society that you are a woman of unclear judgment or moral standing. It communicates that the Duke of Ravensmore has married beneath his station in ways that extend beyond financial consideration into the realm of genuine unsuitability. The scarring exists, Sophia said with absolute calm. Whether I display it or conceal it does not change the fact of its existence. I have chosen that concealment is more costly than visibility in terms of the energy required to maintain the deception. You are not, the Dowager Duchess said coldly, in a position to make choices regarding family reputation. Your responsibility is to maintain dignity appropriate to your station. The display of scarring suggests disturbance. It suggests that you are a woman incapable of appropriate self-management. The scarring, Sophia replied, was inflicted by my mother when I was 17 years old. It was not self-inflicted. It represents not my lack of judgment, but her deliberate attempt to damage my confidence in my own capability. And I have decided that the time has passed for me to conceal evidence of her cruelty as though it constitutes evidence of my inadequacy. The Dowager Duchess went very still, and in her stillness existed a kind of processing that suggested she was re-evaluating something fundamental about her understanding of her daughter-in-law and the scarring that she had been attributing to self-harm. Your mother deliberately injured you, she said finally, not as a question but as confirmation of information that she was processing. Yes, Sophia confirmed, methodically and deliberately, for the purpose of teaching me that independence was unacceptable and that my value was limited to my appearance and my obedience. The Dowager Duchess returned to her correspondence without responding directly to Sophia's statement, but her hands, as she managed the papers before her, betrayed a quality of tremor that suggested emotion was being contained through deliberate effort. I have been unfair to you, she said finally, without looking directly at Sophia. I have been forming theories regarding your character based on incomplete information. I have been judging you for what I perceived as disturbance without seeking to understand the source of that disturbance. Yes, Sophia agreed, but you have now been provided with accurate information. I hope that you will be willing to reconsider your initial assessment. I am willing, the Dowager Duchess replied, to acknowledge that I misjudged your circumstances. I am willing to acknowledge that your scarring represents not your moral failing, but your mother's cruelty, and I am willing to acknowledge that your decision to cease concealing that scarring represents a kind of courage that I had not anticipated you possessed. It was not quite an apology, but it was sufficient acknowledgement of wrongdoing that Sophia understood the dynamic between herself and her mother-in-law had fundamentally altered. By the third week of July, the initial shock regarding Sophia's visible scarring had been absorbed into the social narrative regarding the Duchess of Ravensmore. Some members of society continued to view her choice as inappropriate. Others began to recognize in her visibility something that transcended simple rebellion, a kind of courage that suggested she understood something about the relationship between concealment and authenticity that most people did not articulate. I wish to establish a charitable initiative, Sophia said to Alexander on the evening of July 4th, as they occupied the library in the quiet hour that had become customary for their most significant conversations. An initiative designed to provide resources and support for women who have experienced deliberate injury at the hands of family members. I wish it to be established not in secret, as a shameful thing that we address quietly but openly, as acknowledgement that such injury exists and that women who have experienced it deserve support. That is revolutionary, Alexander replied, and I suspect it will produce considerable opposition from those who believe that family affairs should remain internal to the family. Yes, Sophia agreed, but I have come to understand that concealment, whether of scarring on one's arms or of violence within a family, permits the continuation of harm. If these things are brought into the light, acknowledged and addressed, it becomes more difficult for them to continue unobserved. What would this initiative provide? Alexander asked. Financial resources for women who need to separate themselves from abusive family situations, Sophia replied. Education regarding their rights and their options. Safe housing, medical care, psychological support, recognition that their damage does not constitute evidence of personal failure, but evidence of survival. You will require significant financial resources, Alexander observed. Yes, Sophia confirmed, which is why I'm requesting your partnership in this endeavor. Not because I am unable to pursue it independently, but because your resources and your position would substantially increase the scope and effectiveness of what could be accomplished. Alexander was silent for a very long time, and his silence communicated that he was processing the implications of what Sophia was proposing. I will support this initiative, he said finally, with all of the resources and authority that I possess, and I will use my position to ensure that the initiative is recognized not as a shameful secret, but as a legitimate charitable endeavor. By the end of the first week of July, the Duchess of Ravensmore had begun the process of establishing what she initially termed the Ashford Foundation for Women's Safety and Independence. The name was, by design, linked directly to her husband's title and position, creating institutional legitimacy for work that might otherwise have been dismissed as inappropriate or radical. David, observing the evolution of the initiative, said to his brother, "You have married a woman who is transforming not simply her own circumstances, but the circumstances of how society understands injury and trauma." "Yes," Alexander agreed, "and I have discovered that my primary responsibility in this marriage is to ensure that she possesses the resources and authority necessary to accomplish what she envisions." On the afternoon of July 8th, a woman appeared at the gate of Ravensmore House, requesting audience with the Duchess. The woman was approximately 30 years old, though her appearance suggested she might have been considerably older, given the evidence of prolonged hardship visible in her features. Her left arm hung at an awkward angle, suggesting that the limb had been broken and inadequately healed. Catherine, Sophia's lady's maid, brought word of the woman's arrival with a quality of gentle discretion that suggested she understood the significance of what was occurring. "There is a woman at the gate requesting to speak with her grace," Catherine said. "She has heard, through means I do not entirely understand, that her grace is establishing support for women in circumstances of distress." Sophia received the woman in a private chamber rather than in a more formal space, understanding that circumstances of this nature required intimate rather than ceremonial setting. The woman's name was Margaret, and she had been living with her brother and his wife in conditions of what she described with careful euphemism as domestic complication. "He broke my arm," Margaret said finally, after considerable time spent discussing less significant matters. 3 months ago, when I suggested that I might wish to establish independent living circumstances, he informed me that such an aspiration was inappropriate for a woman of my station and demonstrated the inappropriateness of my thinking by breaking the arm with which I write. "You have nowhere to reside?" Sophia asked. "I have considered remaining with my brother's family," Margaret replied. "I have considered approaching the local vicar for assistance. I have considered simply accepting that my circumstances are unchangeable and attempting to manage them as they currently exist. But I heard from a woman who heard from another woman who had encountered someone who had met you that you are establishing resources for women in circumstances such as mine." "Yes," Sophia confirmed, "we have resources, and we are establishing infrastructure to provide financial support, secure housing, medical care, and whatever assistance you require to establish independence." "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked, and the question was genuine, suggesting she could not comprehend why anyone with resources would choose to expend them on her behalf. Sophia extended her arms, allowing the scarring to be fully visible to the woman before her. "Because I have lived with the evidence of deliberate injury," she replied, "and I have discovered that survival is possible, but it requires that someone, or someones, be willing to acknowledge that the injury occurred and that resources can be devoted to healing rather than simply enduring." By the evening of July 8th, Margaret had been installed in temporary accommodations at Ravensmoor House, pending the completion of arrangements that would allow her to establish residence in a cottage located on the estate's outer reaches. The cottage would provide her with independence while maintaining proximity to support systems and resources that the Ashford Foundation would provide. "Your mother did not provide you with this," Margaret said to Sophia as they took tea together in the drawing room. "This is your choice, your creation." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "My mother attempted to convince me that I was incapable of independent action, that my value was limited to decoration and obedience, and I have spent the past 3 months understanding that I possess considerable capacity for action, provided that I am willing to be visible rather than invisible." "And you are willing," Margaret observed. "I am," Sophia confirmed. "I am discovering that visibility, though it creates complications, is preferable to the alternative." By the middle of July, the Ashford Foundation had received inquiries from 4 additional women requesting assistance. Each woman's circumstances were different in the specific details, but all shared a fundamental characteristic. They had been damaged by family members who had attempted to convince them that the damage was evidence of personal failure rather than evidence of familial cruelty. Sophia found herself in the position of interviewer, counselor, and advocate. She found herself listening to narratives of injury that echoed in their fundamental architecture the narrative of her own damage. And she found herself discovering that her willingness to be visible regarding her own scarring gave permission and power to women who had been trained to conceal their own evidence of survival. "I will not tell anyone about my circumstances," one woman, a girl of approximately 19, said during her initial conversation with Sophia. "I have been taught that speaking about such things is shameful. That to do so is to admit that I failed in my responsibility to manage the relationship appropriately." "Who taught you that?" Sophia asked. "My father," the girl replied. When he began to engage in behavior that was inappropriate, he informed me that if I spoke of it, I would be the source of shame to my family, that I would be responsible for my mother's suffering, that my role was to accept what was occurring and maintain silence." "And do you believe that teaching?" Sophia asked. The girl was silent for a very long time, and then she extended her hand and showed Sophia the scars on her wrists, marks that suggested the girl had attempted to harm herself, perhaps as a form of communicating pain that she could not articulate through words. "I believe," the girl said finally, "that I will die if I continue to maintain the silence. And I am beginning to understand that dying in service of protecting someone who has harmed me is not a form of loyalty, but a form of self-destruction." By the end of July, Sophia had begun to understand that her own transformation from concealment to visibility had created the possibility of transformation for other women, that her willingness to be seen had communicated that being seen was not equivalent to being destroyed. That survival could be something more than simply enduring damage. It could be the foundation for genuine reconstruction and healing. "You have created something remarkable," the Dowager Duchess said to Sophia on the evening of July 28th, as they took tea together in a gesture that would have been inconceivable 3 months prior. "You have taken your own damage and transformed it into purpose. You have taken your own visibility and created space for other women to become visible as well." "I have simply chosen not to conceal," Sophia replied, "and in choosing not to conceal, I have discovered that others are willing to stop concealing as well." "That is considerably more than simple choice," the Dowager Duchess replied. "That is transformation. That is revolution." And Sophia, observing the women who had begun to arrive at Ravensmoor House, women bearing evidence of various forms of damage, women who had been trained to conceal their injury, women who were beginning to understand that visibility and survival were not contradictory, recognized that something fundamental had altered, that her own scarring, which had once represented only damage and shame, had become evidence of capability, that her own willingness to be visible had become the foundation upon which other women could construct visibility for themselves. By the 29th of July, The Ashford Foundation had evolved from theoretical construct into operational reality, with the kind of momentum that suggested institutional permanence was not merely possible, but inevitable. The cottage that had been prepared for Margaret had been occupied within 3 days. 3 additional cottages had been made available for the other women who had arrived requesting assistance, and inquiries were arriving with sufficient frequency that Sophia understood the foundation required substantial expansion if it was to serve the women who were seeking its resources. "We are receiving correspondence from women in 5 counties," Sophia said to Alexander on the evening of July 31st, as she displayed the collection of letters that had arrived throughout the day. Each letter describes circumstances similar to those already documented. Each letter communicates hope that resources might be available, and each letter represents a woman who has been trained to believe that her damage is personal failure rather than evidence of familial cruelty. "The scope is expanding beyond what we initially anticipated," Alexander observed, as he examined the letters with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was processing implications. "Yes," Sophia confirmed, "which means that the infrastructure must expand as well. We require additional properties. We require trained staff who can provide medical care and psychological support. We require legal resources to assist women in navigating the complications of separating themselves from abusive family situations. We require considerably more financial resources than we initially anticipated." "I will authorize the allocation of funds," Alexander said without hesitation. "I will also authorize the acquisition of additional properties in locations that would serve women from various regions. But I will require that you establish clear protocols regarding who will be accepted into the Foundation's care, what services will be provided, and what the expectations will be regarding the women's progression toward independence." By the 15th of August, the Ashford Foundation had established formal protocols. Women would be accepted regardless of the specific nature of their injury or trauma, provided that the injury or trauma had been inflicted by family members and that the woman was seeking to establish independence. The Foundation would provide housing, medical care, education, and financial resources sufficient to allow women to establish themselves in independent circumstances. Most significantly, the Foundation would provide something that extended beyond physical resources. It would provide recognition. The women who came to Ravensmoor House seeking assistance would be met with the understanding that their damage was not evidence of personal failure but evidence of survival, that their willingness to seek help was not weakness but capability. "You have created something unprecedented," David said, observing the 4 cottages that now housed the first residents of the Foundation. "You have created institutional structure around something that society views as private family affair." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "And in doing so, I have made it considerably more difficult for families to continue injuring women under the assumption that such injury will remain invisible and unaddressed." By the end of August, 12 women were residing in Foundation properties. By the middle of September, the number had increased to 23. The estate itself had begun to transform, no longer simply the residence of the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor, but the headquarters of an institution that was fundamentally altering how society understood and responded to familial violence. The backlash when it arrived was not violent, but insidious. It manifested in the withdrawal of invitations to social events. It manifested in the subtle cooling of relationships that had previously been cordial. It manifested in rumors, carefully constructed narratives suggesting that the Duchess of Ravensmoor had engaged in inflammatory behavior designed to embarrass her family and expose private matters that should have remained internal to family structures. "Your wife is becoming a figure of considerable controversy," the Earl of Ashworth said to Alexander at his club on the 22nd of September. "She is encouraging women to betray family confidences. She is creating institutional structures that undermine paternal authority. She is, by some assessments, engaging in behavior that borders on sedition. My wife is providing resources to women who have been deliberately injured by family members," Alexander replied coldly. "If providing such resources constitutes sedition, then I embrace sedition." But the opposition was not limited to private criticism. By the beginning of October, questions had been raised in Parliament regarding whether charitable organisations should be permitted to operate without parliamentary oversight, whether women should be permitted to reside in institutional housing without male authority figures. whether the Duchess of Ravensmore was engaged in behavior that constituted inappropriate interference with family authority. "They are attempting to legislate against the Foundation," Sophia said to Alexander as she received news of the parliamentary questions. "They are attempting to construct legal barriers to what we are accomplishing. Then we will engage in political response," Alexander replied. "I will utilize my position in the House of Lords to defend the Foundation's legitimacy and necessity, and I will ensure that any attempt to legislate against women's autonomy encounters resistance." What was unexpected, however, was the support that emerged to counterbalance the opposition. Other members of Parliament, progressive individuals who recognized in the Foundation's work something that transcended family privacy and entered into genuine social necessity, began to advocate for legal protections rather than legal restrictions. "The Foundation is addressing a problem that has always existed," Lord Pemberton argued in Parliament on the 15th of October. "Women have been injured and exploited within family structures since family structures existed. The question is not whether such injury should occur. Clearly it should not. The question is whether we as a society will continue to permit such injury to occur in secrecy, or whether we will create institutional structures to provide alternatives and support." By the end of October, the parliamentary opposition had failed to produce legislative restrictions. Instead, the discussion had shifted toward recognition that the Ashford Foundation was addressing a genuine social need. Newspapers that had initially been critical began to publish sympathetic accounts of women whose lives had been transformed through the Foundation's assistance. And perhaps most significantly, other women of social standing and considerable resources, began to approach Sophia expressing interest in establishing similar foundations in their own regions. "You have created revolution," the Dowager Duchess observed to her daughter-in-law on the evening of October 28th, "not through violence or through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet work of providing alternatives and acknowledging truth." "I have simply refused to conceal," Sophia replied, "and in refusing to conceal, I have made it more difficult for others to continue concealment." The letter arrived on the 16th of November, delivered by private courier from the Merryweather estates. Sophia recognized her father's handwriting immediately, and her hands, when she took the letter, trembled with the kind of physical response that suggested her body understood before her mind could process that the communication represented threat. The letter was brief and conclusive. Lord Merryweather was informing his daughter that her continued operations of the Ashford Foundation constituted public defamation of the Merryweather family, that her revelation of her mother's cruelty was a betrayal of family confidentiality, that her actions had resulted in social complications for her brother and his family, who were attempting to establish themselves respectably. Most significantly, he was informing her that she was no longer welcome at the Merryweather estates, that any future communication regarding family matters would be conducted through legal channels, that she had effectively severed her relationship with the family of her birth through her choice to prioritize the truth of her experience over the reputation of the family. "He is threatening to disown you," Alexander said, reading the letter with the kind of care that suggested he was processing implications that transcended simple parental disapproval. "He has already disowned me," Sophia replied, "in writing, through communication that is sufficiently formal that it constitutes legal document. Do you require time to grieve this loss?" Alexander asked. "I require time to determine whether I am grieving the loss of a father or whether I am experiencing relief that a source of threat has been removed," Sophia replied with complete honesty. "My father was the man who permitted my mother to injure me. He was the man who allowed my mother to damage my arms and my confidence. He was the man who used my damaged circumstances as justification for arranging my marriage, as a resolution to his financial complications. I am not certain that grieving is the appropriate emotional response." But in the days that followed the receipt of the letter, Sophia discovered that emotional response was considerably more complex than simple relief. She discovered that she was experiencing simultaneous sensations: relief that she was no longer required to attempt to maintain relationship with a family that had harmed her, and grief that the family she had been born into could not simply accept her visibility and her truth without perceiving it as betrayal. "He is attempting to undermine the foundation," David said, arriving at Ravensmore House on the 20th of November with news of his encounter with Lord Merryweather at his club. "He is suggesting that the foundation was established not from genuine compassion, but from desire for revenge against your parents. He is suggesting that your visibility regarding your scars is performative rather than authentic. Does that assessment alter the reality of what we are accomplishing? Sophia asked. No, David replied. It does not alter the reality, but it does complicate the narrative that has been constructed around you and the Foundation. If the public believes that your motivation is revenge, rather than genuine concern for other women's welfare, the Foundation's effectiveness is diminished. What occurred over the subsequent weeks was a kind of internal crisis that transcended simple family conflict. Sophia was forced to confront the possibility that her own visibility and her own truth-telling might be motivated, at least in part, by desire for vindication and revenge against those who had harmed her. That her choice to be visible might be, to some degree, an attempt to force others to acknowledge her pain, rather than simply an acknowledgement of her survival. I do not know if my motivations are pure, she said to Alexander on the evening of November 25th. I do not know if I am helping other women because I genuinely believe that such help is necessary, or if I am helping other women because helping them allows me to feel powerful in circumstances where my own family rendered me powerless. These motivations are not mutually exclusive, Alexander replied. You can be simultaneously motivated by genuine compassion and by desire to transform the powerlessness that you experienced into power that you now possess. You can be simultaneously helping other women and healing yourself. The two things are not contradictory. But if my motivations are impure, Sophia said, then perhaps the Foundation is not as legitimate as I have believed it to be. The Foundation is legitimate, Alexander replied with absolute certainty, because the women who reside in it are receiving genuine assistance and genuine support. Whether your motivations are pure or impure does not alter that reality. The truth of what you are accomplishing is independent of the complexity of your emotions regarding why you are accomplishing it. By the 15th of December, the internal crisis that had characterized the previous weeks had been transformed into something approaching clarity. Sophia had come to understand that her motivations regarding the Foundation were indeed complex, that compassion and desire for vindication existed simultaneously, and that acknowledging this complexity did not diminish the legitimacy of the work. What emerged from this understanding was a kind of resolution. Instead of attempting to deny or minimize her personal investment in the Foundation's work, Sophia embraced it. She began to speak publicly about her own experience, not as evidence of moral failing, but as the foundation upon which her understanding of other women's experiences rested. I understand the women who come to the Foundation because I have experienced what they have experienced, she said, addressing an assembly of society women on the 18th of December. I understand the systematic nature of familial cruelty because I have endured it, and I understand the possibility of survival and transformation because I have witnessed it in my own life. My personal experience is not a liability in the work of the Foundation. It is the Foundation itself upon which all other work rests. The speech was reported in 3 newspapers, including publications that had previously been critical of the Foundation's work. And in the days that followed the speech, something fundamental shifted in how society perceived Sophia and the institution that she had created. The Ashford Foundation began to receive contributions from wealthy patrons who recognized in the work something that transcended simple charity, an acknowledgement that society had responsibility for addressing injustice that occurred within family structures. By the end of December, the Foundation's financial resources had tripled, and inquiries regarding the establishment of satellite facilities in other regions had become commonplace. You have accomplished something remarkable, the Dowager Duchess said to Sophia on the 21st of December, as they took tea together, in a gesture that had become routine over the previous months. You have taken your own damage and transformed it into institutional structure that will persist long after you are no longer able to personally direct it. I have created the beginning of something, Sophia replied carefully. The true accomplishment will be determined by what others do with the Foundation that I have established. On the 23rd of June, precisely 1 year from her wedding day, Sophia discovered that she was carrying a child. The discovery occurred in a moment of ordinary domesticity. She was experiencing nausea that she had initially attributed to the emotional exhaustion of the previous months, but which Catherine, her lady's maid, had suggested might indicate pregnancy rather than simple illness. Dr. Whitmore, the family physician, confirmed the assessment on the 25th of June, Sophia was approximately 6 weeks into a healthy pregnancy. "Your Grace is experiencing what appears to be a very healthy pregnancy," he said, with the kind of gentle professionalism that had come to characterize his interactions with the Duchess. The pregnancy proceeded from a time of emotional stability and genuine partnership. These factors typically indicate positive prognosis. The revelation of her pregnancy transformed Sophia's understanding of what was possible. She was not simply a woman who had survived damage and transformed that survival into action. She was a woman who would become a mother. She would pass on to her children not the inheritance of secrecy and shame that she had inherited, but the inheritance of visibility and truth-telling. "I am terrified," she said to Alexander, on the evening that she informed him of the pregnancy. "I am terrified that I will replicate my own mother's cruelty, that I will attempt to control and damage my children the way that I was controlled and damaged." "You are not your mother," Alexander replied with absolute certainty. "Your awareness of the possibility of replicating her behavior demonstrates that you are fundamentally different from her. She never questioned her own actions. You question everything: your motivations, your methods, your impact. That questioning is the protection that your children require." By the end of June, the Ashford Foundation had served 137 women. 43 women had successfully established independent living circumstances and had relocated from foundation properties. 94 women remained in foundation care, progressing toward their own independence at their own pace. And Sophia, who had begun the year as a woman concealing systematic injury beneath carefully maintained sleeves, had evolved into a woman whose visibility had created possibility for visibility in others. Her pregnancy was not an endpoint, but a continuation, the next chapter in a story that had been defined by her willingness to be seen completely and to create space for others to be seen as well. "What shall we name the child if it is a daughter?" the Dowager Duchess asked in a moment of genuine affection. "I have not yet considered," Sophia replied, "but I suspect we will choose a name that suggests strength, that suggests the capacity to endure, that suggests the possibility of transformation. Margaret, perhaps," Alexander suggested, in recognition of the first woman who came seeking the Foundation's assistance. "Margaret," Sophia repeated, and in the name existed not simply commemoration of another woman's journey, but acknowledgement of how her own journey had been intertwined with the journeys of the women she had served. The child born to Sophia and Alexander on the 31st of January was indeed a daughter, and she was named Margaret Eleanor, combining the name of the first Foundation resident with the middle name of Sophia's own mother, creating a bridge between past trauma and future hope. 5 years later, on the 21st of June, the Ashford Foundation reached a milestone that Sophia had not anticipated when she first proposed the initiative. 423 women had been served by the Foundation. 192 had successfully established independent living circumstances, and the Foundation had expanded to include satellite operations in 7 counties, each serving women who required asylum and support. Margaret Eleanor, now 5 years old, bore no evidence of the trauma that had marked her mother's childhood. She was a child of visible love, of genuine partnership, of safety that extended beyond her immediate family into the institutional structures that her mother had created. "Will you tell me about the scars?" Margaret Eleanor asked her mother on an afternoon in mid-June, as she observed the scarring on her mother's forearms with the kind of innocent curiosity that only a child who had never been taught to conceal evidence of family violence could manifest. "Yes," Sophia replied, settling beside her daughter with the kind of care that suggested she understood the significance of what she was about to communicate. "I will tell you that the scars are evidence of my survival, that they are evidence that when my mother attempted to damage my confidence in my own capability, I endured, that they are evidence that I did not permit that damage to define my entire life." "And now you help other people who have scars?" Margaret Eleanor asked. "Yes," Sophia confirmed. "I help other people who have been damaged by family members understand that the damage does not have to define their entire lives. That survival is possible. That transformation is possible." Alexander, observing his wife and daughter, recognized something that had been absent from his own childhood, the possibility of being seen completely and being loved anyway, the possibility of damage being acknowledged without shame, the possibility of visibility creating safety rather than danger. By evening, the celebration of the Foundation's 5th anniversary was in full progress. Members of Parliament attended. Philanthropists attended. Most significantly, the women who had been served by the Foundation attended. women who had come seeking shelter and who had discovered that shelter could be a foundation upon which entire new lives could be constructed. Sophia stood before them and acknowledged what had been accomplished, not simply the physical structures that had been established, not simply the financial resources that had been mobilized, but the fundamental shift in how society understood and responded to the reality that women could be deliberately harmed by family members and that such harm could be acknowledged and addressed rather than perpetually concealed. 5 years ago, Sophia said, her voice steady and clear, I chose to stop concealing the evidence of my own damage. I chose to become visible. And in becoming visible, I discovered that visibility creates possibility. That being seen completely does not result in destruction. That truth, even when it is complicated and difficult, is preferable to concealment. She extended her arms, displaying the scarring that had become not evidence of shame, but evidence of survival. This is who I am, she said. And because I am willing to be who I am completely, other women are discovering that they can be who they are completely as well. That damage does not define capability. That survival is worthy of recognition. That transformation is possible. The women who had been served by the Foundation stood as Sophia concluded her remarks, and in their standing existed acknowledgement of something that had seemed impossible to them when they first arrived seeking the Foundation's assistance, that they could become visible, that they could transform their damage into strength, that they could become architects of their own futures rather than merely enduring the futures that had been imposed upon them. Alexander, observing his wife, recognized that he had not simply married a woman, he had married a force for transformation, that his choice to accept her visibility rather than demand her concealment had created possibility not simply for his marriage, but for an entire institution that would serve women for generations to come. By the end of the celebration, the Foundation had received commitments of funding sufficient to expand operations into 12 additional counties. Medical professionals and educators had volunteered their expertise, and most significantly, women who had been served by the Foundation had expressed interest in joining its administrative structure, creating the possibility that the institution would eventually be led by women who understood from lived experience precisely what the women seeking its assistance required. What do you believe we have accomplished? Alexander asked Sophia, as they stood together on the terrace overlooking the Foundation's grounds, watching the celebration continue into the evening. We have accomplished, Sophia replied carefully, the beginning of something that is considerably larger than ourselves. We have created institutional recognition that damage does not have to be perpetually concealed, that truth, even when it is difficult, is preferable to concealment, and that visibility, though it carries risk, also carries possibility. Is that sufficient? Alexander asked. No, Sophia replied. It is not sufficient. There is considerable work that remains to be done. There are numerous women who have not yet discovered that the Foundation exists. There are societies and systems that have not yet been challenged regarding their acceptance of familial violence. There are laws that have not yet been reformed to provide adequate protection. Then the work continues, Alexander observed. Yes, Sophia confirmed, the work continues, and I am grateful that I am no longer attempting to accomplish it invisibly. I am grateful that I can be visible in my effort. I am grateful that my daughter will grow up understanding that visibility is not shame, but capability. As they stood together in the quiet of the evening, with the sounds of celebration continuing behind them, Sophia and Alexander recognized that their marriage, which had begun as obligation, had evolved into partnership, that the damage that each carried, his from paternal violence, hers from maternal cruelty, had not been permitted to define them or diminish them. Instead, that damage had become the foundation upon which something greater had been constructed, not despite their damage, but because of their willingness to acknowledge it and transform it into purpose. The invisible seamstress had become duchess. The broken widower had become a man of genuine compassion. Together they had created something that would outlast them both. An institution dedicated to the recognition that damage does not have to be perpetual, that concealment does not have to be permanent, and that visibility, though it carries risk, carries the possibility of transformation. Thank you for spending nearly 2 hours with Sophia and Alexander, a love story that transcended obligation to become revolution. If their journey from concealment to visibility moved your heart, please share it with someone who believes that damage does not define destiny. Subscribe to Victorian Romance, audio stories for more narratives celebrating transformation, courage, and the quiet power of truth. Comment below. Which moment of Sophia's journey resonated most with you? And tell us, what would you do if you discovered that visibility was safer than concealment? Your voice matters.